morning, everyone. Old friends, glad to meet you this morning and hope you're all with us. Yes, we will be talking to old friends, and we hope reminding you of some of the things gone by in regard to the old place out in the country and the old rural schools. And we have with us a special guest, Paul Nagle. Many of you know Paul, and we'll know him better later too. And Paul has gone through like myself, went to rural school, and he was a teacher in the rural schools. And he's been a teacher in the Department of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire for a good many years. And we'll find out more about all this. And Paul, it's good to have you with us this morning.
Thank you, Pat. Real nice to share reminiscences and nostalgia.
It's fun, isn't it?
I guess perhaps when we get past 65, that's more funner than anything.
Yes, I agree with you. Well, I'm sure our listeners, and for those that aren't quite in our age bracket, I'm sure we're going to have some thoughts for our younger people so they'll know what they really missed out on when it comes to the old rural school. Well, Paul, what part of the state did you go to school, first of all, in the rural area?
Well, I was born in Taylor County, and a lot of people know where Jump River is, yes. And that's exactly where I was raised. Went to a rural school there for 8 years of education. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, Paul, you taught 1 or more years. Where did you teach in the rural schools?
Well, I finished the 2-year normal course, and that's all that was required for elementary teachers in those days, especially the rural school teacher. And because the war was coming on, I got a school as close to home as I could so I could live with Mother and Dad. And so this was at the Woodland School at Jump River, Wisconsin. I taught 1 year before I was drafted.
I see. Well, we know you're up where it was pretty cold anyhow. Now, Paul, one thing that's come to my mind after all the years and never really pinned it down, on what rhyme or reason was there for establishing rural schools? Was it hit and miss, or were there some legal entanglements, or what about it?
Well, I tell you, if you can picture in your mind a wilderness cutover area, 2 or 3 families, perhaps one to start with, moved into an area, and now suddenly we have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 children to deal with. Mm-hmm. We have to have a school. So as close to that point of civilization, we will build a school. Dependent, and if there's another one off there someplace that the children can walk to. But I've done some research on a number of these schools, and it was a case of having a rural school right here and now, because our children need education this fall. And I should interject, while we're on that topic, there was no rhyme nor reason, no. There was an attempt, if they could, to build those schools within 4 miles of each other, so any children only had to walk 2 miles to get to their own school. However, a lot of those schools had their beginnings in the leftover living room or an upstairs room. I have one school in mind that began, it was the Sunnyside School in Taylor County that began in an old lumber camp. That was there, the building was available, set up a stove, bring in some desks, and now we have a school.
And Paul, I suppose there was no state or federal aid of any kind. It was the local people, up to them to spend their money to build a school, buy the land, build a school?
Oh, yes. Yes, it was a case of pretty much local control and local responsibility. And so the taxation that came through the township went toward building the building. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, who operated this school? Who ran the thing?
Well, the administrative structure of the rural school was pretty simple, really. Generally, they had 3 school board members right here in this little community. Now, if there were 3 families, you have a pretty good idea who's going to be elected on the school board. And so there were 3 school board members who ran that school administratively. And we understand, of course, that there was a single teacher, but then it was supervised out of the county seat. Now, a little interesting figure, and I think I have this right. Before the consolidation of schools back about 1955, it would surprise you to know that we had something in the neighborhood of 7,777 school districts in the state of Wisconsin. Now, if you box that out in little 4-mile boxes, it isn't hard to imagine.
Yes. Well, that sure explains. I was wondering, I know there are quite a few school districts right in our own little township, and as I know, these counties around here, each township had 2 or 3, 4 or 5, didn't they, themselves, and many in each county.
35 to 40 in a county.
And so the school board, the 3 members, and my dad was on the school board, I always remember that, they hired the teacher.
Yep.
What did they pay her about in these rural schools in the early days?
Well, I have some records of teachers around the turn of the century, 1903, 1905. They were getting $37 a month, and it was an interesting addition. They were given an extra $2 to do the janitorial work. Of course, that is not to say that they didn't build the fires themselves and sweep the floor. That was their job. Sometimes they hired a boy in the neighborhood, sometimes a couple of the girls who were 8th graders to sweep the floor after school, and that's where the $2 went. Well,
I never heard of that. I think I remember when our school board and my dad was contemplating paying a teacher $60 a month, and that was, they thought they were up among the real biggies, and they probably were at that time too. Well, now this teacher, her responsibilities, she had to usually, in my school, we had all women teachers in my day. Yeah. And those girls came from towns around or another community. They had to find a place to stay in the community and get their own transportation, and, pay their room and board and all that.
You're right. And of course, let me interject a thought there too. I reckon into the records that say up to about 1910, the constituency in the community, the people in the community had to vote to hire a lady teacher. It wasn't like as if you'd go out and hire anyone. Your choice was a man, and then the people had to agree that it'd be okay to hire a woman. There weren't any men to be had.
No, I didn't think so.
So
I never heard of that.
And you know, some of those young ladies went a long way to get a job.
Yes.
I have had a good friend. In fact, I lived with her in the country when I taught in a country school, who had come to Taylor County from Florence County to get a rural school job at $37 a month. I figured it must have taken her about 2 days by train to get there.
Yes, and then she had to pay her room and board while she was there. Well, now, a morning, I'm thinking about some of these teachers, and many of them stayed at our house. We had a little more room, and not too far. We were half a mile from school. But 20 below zero, they closed the school at maybe 4:30 the day before, and it was 8 o'clock the next morning when they got there. What did they have to do, first of all?
Well, this was always a problem, and I come to you with experience on this. Hiking down the road and preparing a fire to get it warm enough so that children could endure by 9 o'clock. And so you were about to build the fire in the old pot-bellied stove and get it roaring so that it would drive some of the cold away. There was, let me suggest that there, you know, the forces of nature that hit you just about the time you hit the schoolhouse too. So the pleasantry of the outdoor facilities wasn't always conducive to gentleness.
Well, I wouldn't feel so bad for you, but I think of some of those young ladies that were teachers that had to start those fires and all that too. And Paul, I remember in the early days when I was first, I started to school at 4 years of age. And by the way, I was the only 8th grader that graduated in my class, so I was the top of the class, you see, at 8th grade.
Most likely to succeed.
Well, anyhow, I think we had to go and pump a pail of water. We had a granite pail and a granite dipper. And there were around 30, 35 in our school. And I guess this was common, the only way, wasn't it? The dipper hung there. We all drank out of it all day.
Yes, yes. I'm not sure when the drinking fountain came in. This is an example of a drinking fountain, and I was able to get this from one of the old rural schools. That was introduced perhaps in the neighborhood of 1915 to 1920. I would say. And, of course, then the boys had to carry the water and pour it in there, and then you had the delightful experience of pushing that button.
Right.
Most of us had never done anything like that
this
before.
Bubbled up here.
Yeah. Teacher used to complain about wasting water because you know, if we waste it, we have to carry more. There was a little little catch bucket down below there.
Sure. And I remember our first one. I was still in school when we changed from the old bucket to this, but ours didn't have this bubbler on. We had a cup.
Oh,
you push the button, and if you want your own cup, or maybe you had a cup to serve several people, I don't know. Well, and she had to be sure the water is dumped out of that at night, or it would freeze and break it, wouldn't it?
Indeed, yes.
She had a lot of responsibilities.
And it's also true that many times the school, having been built just this summer, had no water on the compound, so they'd hire one of the 8th grade boys, maybe $1 a month, to carry from a neighbor that had a pump, and then they would fill it.
Paul, we'll take a little breather here and be back for more after this message.
All right, good.
Hello once again, old friends. We're back and have with us today Paul Nagle, who has been a teacher in the rural school, and many years a teacher in the Department of Education, of course, down at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. We're enjoying our visit with him about rural schools. What was that for, Paul?
That was time to begin, brother, when you heard that bell. Some of the old rural schools had this huge brass bell up in the tower, but sometimes they settled for the $1.98 model, and the teacher came out the door, and everybody came hustling into the classes.
On the porch, she rang the bell. It was time the fun was over with. And Paul, what did you think? Now, in a great school, that teacher had all the way from 1st grade or kindergarten or whatever, clear up to 8th grade and everything in between. Were there some advantages to this teaching?
Oh, yes, indeed. You know, as you started out in the morning, and I'm not sure how long this might take, but you know, you had 1st grade reading and 2nd grade reading and 3rd and 4th grade reading and 5th and 6th grade reading and then 7th and 8th grade reading, and all of that happened before recess.
Yes.
And then after recess, you started that all over again, but there was math for the upper grades. So on one hand, the little ones were learning from the older ones were reviewing from the younger ones, and so a lot was to be learned from the situation in which they functioned. And I guess for those who don't remember or didn't know, you'd ought to know that there was a recitation bench in front. And generally that's the way, today we would have chairs and a table, but there was a recitation bench, and then the class would come up. Grade 1 would come up and sit and swing their feet under the bench while the teacher taught, and then they would shift.
And the 8th graders were there, the little ones were listening. Now, I suppose they should have been studying, but I always thought I remember things that I think I learned as a 4th grader from listening to the 8th graders. I'm trying to find a little good of the old system of being cold and hungry and all that. And I think, speaking about being cold, I remember we carried our lunch in an old molasses pail or something, Paul. Sat it back there, and sometimes by noon, the stove was up in front. By noon, that was pretty hard. We kind of had to harden our teeth to chew the jelly sandwiches, but we made it all right,
Jam sandwiches, like 2 pieces of jam, or bread jam together?
And sorghum was a very, we had made sorghum in the fall, you know. Well, now, these lunches, speaking about that, what about hot lunches? When did they come along?
Well, as you talk to some of the folks that were in attendance at rural schools, you found practically every school made an attempt at a hot lunch before there was any government assistance. So the teacher would recommend that they bring along a pail of soup, perhaps, and they'd put it on the stove at the recess time, and then it would simmer and warm until noontime. And I think perhaps every school has the experience of putting the pail on the stove without removing the lid first, and it blew off and created a lot of excitement. When did hot lunches come? Well, I don't know. There were oranges and apples and fruits that the kids in the country weren't able to get a hold of, but it wasn't a hot lunch. I guess probably it surely didn't come much before the 40s where they were able to bring in some volunteer help and cook a lunch for the kids.
I recall that it was being talked about the time I finished grade schools out in the country, and so then I went into high school and so on. Paul, I know our time is short, so many things I'd like to ask you, but let's not overlook, where does the rural high school come in here? Now, our little towns had a high school, and they were probably more rural than urban, weren't they?
Well, yes. I guess perhaps it had to do with a developmental thing that could not have happened unless someone had had a great deal of foresight. But you know, most of our rural areas were not covered with any sort of high school coverage at all. The lines of the school ended right here, and if you were over there, you weren't in a high school district. Your district, your own rural district, might pay tuition to send you to the high school, but you had no privileges of just walking in. And so, as taking the case of Eau Claire, perhaps south of town was Lois Creek, and that was a rural school district. They did not have a high school district. Now, interestingly, probably, well, it was in 1955, I believe, that there was some legislation created which made every kid in the school living in a high school district. So from then on, kids had to be hauled. Now, we know that kids got an education. In your case, you walked a long ways. Sometimes they had a horse and buggy that went to high school. My freshman year of high school, we drove about 10 miles. In order to get to a high school, we did not have a high school. And then a thing that was very, very common for people that you will find that are 60 to 80 years old, they would move to town like the college kids do today. They'd rent an apartment, or they'd work for the room and board in order to go to high school.
Well, Paul, excuse me, that certainly recalls. I could go to high school. I drove to high school 6 miles, but when the winter came on, me and my sister, we stayed in town. Yes, sure. Just like you're saying, we had to stay in town until the roads dried up in the spring again.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so if you happen to glance around to grandparents or people that are 70 years old and they don't want to admit they didn't have high school education, they'll tell you fast, there wasn't one.
That's right.
There wasn't one.
That's right.
I guess I can be grateful to the Lord for the experience that I had. I was the last of 6 boys, and I was the first to be able to finish high school because the high school was there. The consolidation made it possible.
I see. Yes, well, that was pretty rare when you even finished grade school. And of course, we must remember too, Paul, for our listeners or younger ones, out on the farms, like my brother, when spring works come, he had to quit school, and so did many of the older boys to help at home on the farm. And then, of course, I pity the poor teacher again, especially the lady teachers. Some of those great big 6-footers came to school in the wintertime just to, I guess, they had nothing else to do, and she'd have a real struggle with some of them. I suppose you knew how to handle those kind of fellows.
Well, my teaching experience was limited in that area, although I had a couple of boys, and I would kid them today about it, a couple of Magdalene boys who lived in my district, and they were only about 11 or 12 years old. They'd rather stay home, drive the team, cut logs, than they would go to school. I don't blame them.
Yes, well, now I think you have some material or want to tell us something about the designs of the old schools or the structure of them that you've done some work on.
Oh, yes. Well, the pattern, the format, structure, the architecture of the school was rather interesting. They had something to do with, to start with, you came in a middle door in the back. Sometimes there were 2 doors because there was a rule in those days, boys couldn't come in the same door as the girls. I don't know why. No. And then if there was a single door, you separated, and the girls went to this hall and hung their coats up and put down their dinner pails. Boys went to this hall. And then they integrated again as they got out into the main auditorium. Now here again, you can think all the way from 5 or 6 children up to 75 in a single classroom.
Yeah,
and
right.
they were just stacked one on top of the other. Into a community. I had a friend that taught at Bellinger, Wisconsin, and he declares he had 75 children and half of them couldn't talk English. And so he had a job on his hands. But the structure was, I don't know, I was going to say 20 by 30 feet. That was adequate for this one wide open room. And then there were windows always on the east side. Because that's the way it had to be.
And double desk, we sat there. And I remember, Paul, one of the penalties for one of us boys who wasn't being good was to go and sit with a girl in a double desk.
Now, they never did that to me.
Oh, boy, that
wouldn't have been punishment.
Well, yeah, I don't know, some of us have struck us that way now.
Yeah.
Paul, you're doing things, you're writing a book and so on, and we want to find out more about that before we leave. So we're going to take a little break now, and we'll be back and have you tell us about it.
Okay, fine.
This is Mansell Duncan, and my daughter Sandy is away from home a lot.
But when I'm back home in Tyler, Texas, I know I can still count on my dad for help. There are many children, though, that need medical help for orthopedic and burn-related problems that even their parents can't provide. But excellent care is available totally without cost to children up to age 18 at all Shriners hospitals. If you know a child that needs help, call a Shriner, just like my dad.
Shriners Hospitals, 1-800-237-5055.
Back once again, old friends, and with our guest Paul Nagle as we talk and review and reminisce about the old schools and the old school system. While we're sitting here, Paul, of course, has a little slate. And I remember it was quite important that a lot of us, besides slates on the blackboards, we had our own little slate, didn't we, to write on? So.
Right. It's a little inconceivable in my mind at the present time how one could get along without a Xerox machine. Some of those things we did.
Right.
Wrote it on the chalkboard.
Right. And we have a few little old books here. I notice this one's right around 1900. This is a spelling book, I believe. And Paul, you no doubt have a lot of these different kinds that were the old. Quite a difference, Paul, in the way you would teach them nowadays,
Oh, yes.
right?
Yeah.
A lot of changes made there. And you said you had one of the old McGuffey
I have a McGuffey I had the good fortune of picking up, yes.
And they were highly thought of for years, and still
yes.
are, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, well, we have some private schools that are insisting that that's the way to go. Our grandparents learned out of those, then why shouldn't we? And so it's they're using those yet.
One other little question, Paul, I'd like to throw at you that some of our younger folks might not realize. When I was taking my final exams, in grade school, the county superintendent sent out the examinations, and even our teacher had no idea what he was going to ask in those examinations. So that was really tough, wasn't it, to have to write the same exam all over the whole county from the superintendent?
Well, that it was a built-in factor, which gave us somewhat of a cutoff for those who were able to attend high school and those that perhaps were not able to attend high school. So it was quite a climactic thing. Looked forward to with a lot of expectancy and fear sometimes.
Yes.
I know we walked to the village school several miles away. That's the day I remember getting a whole quarter to spend at the store for my lunch. And then we would sit down and write all forenoon and all afternoon. If we passed the test, then we had graduated.
Yes, all right. It all rings a bell with me very much so. Well, we want to get on a bit. You have become a writer, and I think that you may be a better writer always. I don't know. But you got a book coming out. Now, fill us in on it, Paul.
Well, all right. I'll slip past one or two here quickly. I wrote a book on the Stanley, Merrill, and Phillips Railway, which moved quite nicely and still is on the market. I have a book, I Remember, the History and Lore of Hometown, Jump River, Wisconsin. And they say there isn't enough that has ever happened in Jump River that fill a book that size, but we're proud of it.
It did, but you haven't got it all in there either.
Yes. So the book that we're publishing right now and is hot on the market is 80 Acre Farm. This is a book which is a novel, and I've had nothing but positive responses from people who have read this book. And what I'm trying to do is to capture not only the rural school, but the rural life of the people who, say, came to Wisconsin about 1915 and said, hey, we're going to settle, we're going to start over. We weren't able to make it in Iowa because there wasn't any land left that we could afford, so we're coming here to Wisconsin. And, of course, then they had to have a school, then they had to clear the land, those sorts of things. And there's a good story that goes with it.
Well, that should be one of those books like, we old-timers like to sit down and say, well, it was either that's the way we did it where we were, or else you did it a little differently and we did. It should be very enjoyable to our listeners, elderly as well as the younger people.
Yes, I've run a test on a 4th grader, a 5th grader, and a 6th grader, and they all like it. The one complaint was the 5th grader said that she liked the book, but she couldn't get it away from Grandpa and Grandma. So
that would be understandable.
a good sign.
Yeah. Now, is it out now? Did I miss that, or is it coming out?
It is out.
It is out.
Yes, yes. We're marketing this, and I've got quite a mailing on it. I mail out several a day, sometimes one or two. Sometimes they bunch upon me, but I'm mailing, as well as they're for sale at the museum here in Eau Claire. They're for sale at Little Professor, as well as at the university bookstore. And so they're out there,
Yes.
and people are enjoying them.
And I think in some of the local publications put out by AARP and some of the others, it's being advertised. That's where I saw it.
Yeah. I got some ink on that. Yes, people have said, well, how long does it take you to write a book like that? Of course, you have to think of a plot. You just can't just sit and reminisce. I developed a plot, and then all the rest was in the end of my pen. I had lived it all.
Yes, sure.
Either that or my family had.
Yes.
Older sisters, older brothers who had done this.
A few things that we might have missed here, and you no doubt will have a lot of things about the rural schools. I think you mentioned that in there. But when I went to rural school, I think our term was 8 months. Am I right? Instead of 9?
Yes, that varied a little bit. However, it seems to me, you're telling your age, that somewhere around 1910 to 1915, they went over to the 9 months.
I see.
And of course, the people in the community had to again decide whether or not they wanted an 8 or a 9-month school term.
They and the school board had to come to some terms on that. Yeah.
Right.
Paul, we're going to have a few minutes left after we take this break.
Okay.
Old friends, we're going to wind up our visit today with our friend Paul Nagle here, and we've learned a lot about the old rural schools, and we'll learn more about rural schools and rural living as we see his book that he was just telling us about. Paul, a thought came to me. You taught down here at the University of Eau Claire for many years, and you were in the educational department. I suppose you prepared many rural teachers to go out and do their job.
Well, yes. I guess perhaps, however, I'm going to skirt around that one enough to say that children learn the same now as they did then. But I think the science of learning and teaching has improved in the last 30 or 40 years. We know where we're going. There's research to back it up. However, those principles were invoked back in the early days as well.
When did the preparation of rural teachers really come to an end? At consolidation time back here in the 50s or whenever it was?
Well, I remember one time we said that 1972 was going to be the last of the rural people, but there are a few that came back and finished their 4-year degrees following that. But that was about the end of it.
And that, of course, automatically came about because of consolidation. You mentioned a while ago about the 1-year normal school, which was probably the first teachers I had came out of the 1-year normal school, if they got that. Did they have to have a 1 year?
Yes, that sort of emerged. It kind of came from a course in high